start. That's a reminder that this meeting is being recorded and it will be made available later on our advisory committee webpage. I will get started, and I think I'll start by sharing my screen, and also want to recognize some of my co-hosts who are here today. Paul Locke is the Acting Deputy Commissioner for Policy and Planning, and he has joined us. I particularly wanted to have Paul here for the last discussion on the agenda today, which is the EPA announcement of interim and final PFAS-related health advisories. But let me first share my screen and go to the agenda. So we're going to start. I'll provide some general program updates, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Fitzpatrick and Peggy Shaw to give a abbreviated version.
I'm on an online meeting. Let me make sure the mic's on.
Of the technical assistance grants. We had a excuse me. We had an informational meeting on June 14th, and that information is available on the website, but Nancy and Peggy will go through some of that material as well as highlight the deadlines for this year's grant round. And then a good portion of today's meeting will be dedicated to the Marine Oil Spill Prevention and Response Program. Julie Hutcheson is here. She's the coordinator of that program, and she will present an overview of the program and talk about some highlights of the work done in the past year or so, including response training and geographic response planning. And we also have with us, and I notice now that I don't have Sierra Fletcher's last name here, but we have Sierra Fletcher from NUCA Research. Sierra is supporting the department's work as part of NUCA Research on doing response planning around climate change and changes related to decarbonization and rising sea levels. And she's going to talk about that work. And then finally, around 10:15, we'll have some PFAS-related updates, as I mentioned, focused on the EPA health advisories and also just some updated information in terms of the public and private well testing program. So to start, in terms of the status of work, we remain in a hybrid work mode at DEP. We're still, our staff is reporting to the office at least one day a week. Both the Boston and the Northeast office are in the midst of organizing and planning for office moves. We heard, the Boston office heard this week that the October move date is not only a likely sure thing, but they may even try to move it up by a couple of weeks. So we're not going to get any relief there in terms of timing, and we've been really involved in organizing our files, archiving certain files, scanning other files to prepare us for the move to 100 Cambridge Street, where we will really be pretty much a paperless office once we get there. So that has been a big project for us. We've made some good progress, but there's a ways to go. So that will be one thing that a lot of the Boston staff are spending some time on this summer. We've been in all of our offices, Boston, as well as the regional office, is really focused on hiring. related to filling positions that where people have recently retired, kind of trying to get ahead of some of the retirements, really focused on staffing up to the extent we can and building capacity in the agency. I know in the Boston office, we're in the midst of some important hiring. The audit and enforcement coordinator, that's underway, as well as the brownfields coordinator position, contract administrator positions in our technical and financial services group that supports the waste site cleanup work. So there's a lot of activity around that. There's some pretty big news in terms of new roles. About three weeks ago, Gary Moran, who was DEP's Deputy Commissioner for Operations, was moved up to the Secretary's office as an undersecretary, working with Secretary Beth Card. So that is a big role here at DEP. And since Gary has left, his responsibilities have been covered by a combination of Paul Locke, Commissioner Suberg, and Chief of Staff Brian Faris. So Paul at the moment is expanding his responsibilities to do even more for us. Then as of yesterday, this is very breaking news. DCR appointed a new commissioner, and I meant to have his name. Here we go. The new commissioner, Doug Rice. And as you know, since last November, Stephanie Cooper has been serving as the acting DCR commissioner. And with Commissioner Rice coming on board, that means Stephanie will be returning to MassDEP. And I think the effective date of that is tomorrow. So that is big and breaking news in terms of new responsibilities and moving on to the MCP amendment status. We do not have that on the agenda today to kind of do an overview of the final amendments package, but we have in the last couple of months since we last met as a committee, made strides in terms of moving that through the approval process. So we are nearing the end of that process, and we're hopeful that we'll be moving forward with that soon. So I'm pretty hopeful that we will be able to talk more concretely about that the next time we meet. We did talk at the last meeting about putting the topic of refreshing the Waste Site Cleanup Advisory Committee on today's agenda. We had talked about that about this time last year, and we had some ideas about how we might go about doing that. We decided to move that to September's meeting just because we don't have, I feel like we should have a better gathering of the advisory committee members. There were several that couldn't attend today's meeting. But just to set up that discussion for September, I think what we had talked about previously was to look at increasing representation on that committee. We looked at expanding it to include other groups we don't currently have coverage or membership representing, such as environmental justice, communities, public involvement, plan, group representative, for example, better geographic representation around the state. I think most of our committee, because traditionally we were meeting in the Boston office, tended to be from the Boston area and continue to be from the Boston area. So we look to expanding representation that way. We also want to take a look again at mission statement and the role of the committee, and do a better job communicating that information on our website, for example. Talk about term limits and succession planning. I think we've had some success in terms of the last couple of years, particularly owing to being able to do these meetings remotely. I think we have really increased the number of people that are attending the meetings. So that has been a real positive, and that's something, even when we do get a chance to meet in person, we'd like to keep going. I think another positive is that we have set a schedule for these meetings, and we've kept to it in terms of holding the quarterly meetings. And we've continued on with the office hours in the months in between these meetings. So I think those have all been positive steps, but we would like to spend some time talking more about ways to make the committee work best for the program. I think this has always been a very positive, supportive group for the wayside cleanup program, but it's always helpful to take a renewed look at that. So one thing I will be doing over the course of the summer is reaching out to the existing members and just checking in with them in terms of their interest in continuing on with the committee. So we'll have that information when we have that discussion in September. So before I turn this over to Nancy to talk about technical assistance grants, I think I'll pause and see if there are any questions. And I don't know, Paul, can you help me out here? No, I don't see whether there are any hands.
So if you go to participants,
yeah,
and the hands would move to the top of the list.
Okay.
So if you're not seeing it, you don't have to scroll down.
Yeah, I was having trouble finding that. Okay. All right, then I will continue on and let Nancy Fitzpatrick take over. So Nancy, I can advance your slides if you just want to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I'm unmuted, right?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. I'm here just to give a brief update on the technical assistance grants that the department will be offering again this next fiscal year 23. As Liz mentioned, we had an informational meeting for those interested last Tuesday, June 14th in the evening. That was pretty well attended. So this is just kind of a brief summary of what we spoke about, primarily the highlights, since this audience is a little bit more aware of technical assistance grants and the program in general. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay. So in general, the overview of the TAG program, public involvement is indeed a key component of the wayside cleanup program, and the TAG program is designed to help provide funds to eligible applicants, communities, municipalities, what have you, groups that are affected by disposal sites in their area, to help them obtain expert advice in reviewing reports and helping the public gain a better understanding of the MCP process, response actions that are underway at disposal sites in their communities. It's designed primarily to enhance and support public participation and help educate the public, just to have the better knowledge of what is happening in their own communities. Okay, we anticipate this next round of funding to be up to $200,000 and with a maximum of $20,000 per grant. Here we have our estimated timeline. We'll do our best to stick to these dates, but as we said, these are anticipated. They may change. If they change, we would certainly post it on our website and make that public information. As we mentioned, the meeting was last week, Tuesday. The next important dates to be aware of are July 15th, which is when the notice of the grant opportunity will be posted on Combis and the MassDEP website, as well as the official tag grant opportunity and the application itself on the MassDEP website. I provide that at the end of this presentation. The deadline for submission of written questions via email is Tuesday, August 13th. Up until the application going public on July 15th, both Peggy, Shaw, and I are available to answer questions. People can contact us either via email or a phone call. But once the application is posted on July 15th, any questions have to be submitted in writing via email. MassDEP will be posting official answers in writing to the MassDEP website by September, I believe it's September 13th. I can't quite see it and I don't have it written down, but the grant application deadline is October 18th, 5 p.m. That would be via email to me. I'm listed as the point of contact. We anticipate grant award announcements coming out in late January of 2023 with a anticipated contract start date of April 4th of 2023. This is again just emphasizing that all application materials will be posted. This is the MassDEP tag webpage that includes extensive information. So I really encourage anyone to check out this website because it goes through eligibility requirements, gives you citations to where to find this in the regulations, a lot of helpful information. So July 15th will be the release date anticipated for the application going live, and the application deadline, along with all supporting documentations, 5 p.m. Tuesday, October 28th. Okay, just to touch on eligibility, because that is, we get a lot of questions regarding this. So eligible applicants are groups of individuals, community groups, neighborhood associations, municipalities, existing PIP groups can apply. They're not required to apply, but they may apply. A district that runs a public water supply, any group such as this that is affected by oil or hazardous material from a disposal site. Next slide. Ineligible people are people that own or operate the disposal site or are conducting assessment or conducting or funding assessment or cleanup work at a disposal site. Okay, disposal sites that are eligible are those that are actively involved in assessment and cleanup. These include those that are tier classified as tier 1 or tier 2, listed in EPA Superfund National Priorities List, the NPL list, or considered to be adequately regulated. The reason being is that tag funding is used to assist communities better understand response actions. So sites need to be in the process. This is the reason why primarily they need to be involved in phase 1, phase 2 assessment and cleanup. There has to be some level of work ongoing that a community would need assistance with. Next slide, please. Okay, these are just examples of what tag funds may be used for. Hiring a professional, an LSP, an environmental consultant, an attorney, other professional to help interpret technical data and complicated reports that would be generated for a disposal site, as well as conducting public education activities, website developments, community forums, newsletters, that type of thing. Next slide, please. Just some examples of TAG projects that I've touched on already. Hiring an LSP or an environmental consultant to review a phase 2 report and provide an evaluation of it in layman's terms to help a community better understand what's going on in the community and what the next steps might be. Obtaining a risk assessor to help explain a method 3 risk characterization, for example, or as I've mentioned before, websites, community forums, public education activities, outreach, that type of thing. Next slide, please. Okay, this is just the first page of the TAG application that again will be posted on the website in full. It's a fillable Word document. It's to be submitted via email, electronically via email to me as point of contact. It asks for certain information regarding the applicant, disposal site, and it goes through a variety of eligibility criteria that have to be described and met. What happens is once the application is received, it goes through a review to confirm that the applicant is eligible, the disposal site is eligible, and the activities proposed in the project would be considered eligible activities. There is a grant review team that is composed of MassDEP staff who then review and score each application based on how the application and the project fulfills the eligibility criteria. And the grant awards will go to the projects that best meet the TAG program goals of public education, helping people understand what's going on in terms of a disposal site in their community. Next slide. Just some details regarding the awards. One award may be awarded per applicant, and only one award can be awarded per disposal site. A group may use its award to conduct activities for more than one disposal site, but they can only get one grant award. The duration, the contract runs until June 30th, 2024. And the funds are reimbursement funds. So invoices are submitted to the department. They're reviewed to confirm that the activities are eligible, and then DP would reimburse the community or the applicant group for the costs that were incurred. Next slide, please. For further information, here is my email address and telephone numbers, as well as Peggy Shaw, who's my co-program manager, and again, the MassDEP TAG website that contains all of this information. It goes through the eligibility criteria. It provides a lot of useful information, so I do strongly recommend seeking that out. And if you have any further questions, please contact myself or Peggy. And that's it. Do we have any? I don't know if there are any questions that came into the chat or.
I don't see any. Would anyone, if anyone has a question, they're also welcome to unmute themselves and ask it. Okay. So thanks, Nancy.
No problem. Thank you.
And next, Julie. I haven't actually looked to see. Julie,
Yeah,
are you with
I'm
us?
here. Can you hear me? Can
Yes.
everybody hear me?
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Julie, also, I happy to advance your slides. I just would like to introduce Julie Hutcheson, who is our coordinator of the Marine Oil Spill Prevention and Response Program. And as I mentioned earlier, she's going to take us through some of the recent accomplishments of the program.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, next slide. We start with the MOSPRA program through some background. It was born back on April 27th, 2003. The Bouchard B-120 oil spill happened in Buzzards Bay. The barge went aground on a ledge, released approximately 100,000 gallons of thick oil, which impacted about 99 miles of coastline in Buzzards Bay with its intricate coastlines and areas. Next slide. The red, if folks can see it, are the areas that were impacted during the spill. A lot of these, from Buzzards Bay, Fairhaven, Falmouth, all around the Buzzards Bay area. And again, very intricate areas, very hard to reach and respond to. Next one, Liz.
That's at 10:15, of course.
That happened in 2003. And one thing cleanup showed, I was in emergency response at the time for Southeast region when this spill happened. One of the responders basically on scene, watching the oil come ashore, looking at municipalities and residents saying, hey, what are you doing? A lot of response to a spill like this really takes a big ramp up of incident command and response contractors from out of state, etc. So there was a huge gap identified in what was the response that the Commonwealth could handle during the big ramp up was taking place. So in 2004, the Oil Spill Act was passed. So the spill happened in 2003. The Oil Spill Act was passed in 2004. So the gaps and the improvement that needed to be made in our response really needed to be, was totally clear. Next slide. Some of the things for the MOSPRA program is the regulation and all develop this program. We do have an Oil Spill Act Advisory Committee. We try to have an annual meeting. The program is paid for by a 5-cent fee on a barrel of oil that is unloaded at a marine terminal in Massachusetts. So that's the MOSPRA Trust Fund and how it is maintained. It's created areas of special interest to make sure we prevent and respond response to, and also enhance the authority by adding oil to Chapter 21E. Next, Liz. Building the local capability, like I said, we just did not have local ability to take action when this spill occurred. Big parts of the Oil Spill Act were to develop geographic response strategies, distribute oil spill response trailers, and then with trailers and plans, you need to train and test the exercise tactics in the geographic response strategies. So let's get into each of those a little bit. We have 160 geographic response strategies developed for the coastline of Massachusetts, from New Hampshire to Rhode Island. Geographic response strategies used to be called geographic response plans, which I think was a lot easier, but it was a federal decision to change the name. So that's what we did. So now they're GRSs. So 106 throughout the Commonwealth. We broke the state into 6 regions in order to really identify in each area what needs to have GRSs developed and into the North Shore, Boston, South Shore, Cape Islands, Buzzards Bay, and Mount Hope Bay as the areas for development. And I said 160 GRSs, there isn't, that's a lot for one state to have, especially our state that is small, but with a huge and intricate coastline. Next slide. This is what one of the parts of a geographic response plan looks like. It's a map-based response strategy, which identifies the sensitive areas. I have better photos of these, but you may be able to see some of the red lines, identify where boom would be deployed and what tactic and what configuration. Also, they were developed as a consensus plan for non-emergency setting. I was involved in a couple of the development meetings, and it was, well, it kind of dates ourselves because we had people in the room with flip charts and maps, basically putting circles and arrows around what is important, everything from the DPW to the harbor masters to area local groups, So a lot of that was done in the sense of identifying where the GRP should be developed. And it is also used for contract, out-of-state contractors come to Massachusetts. A geographic strategy is a way for them to be told, this is what you're going to do, this is where you're going to do it, and this is what you need to do it. And they are part of the Coast Guard, Sector Boston and Sector Southeast New England area contingency plans, and can use for any spill possible. Next one. I know you can't read this. This is another page of the geographic response strategy, which identifies what's going to be done, who needs to do it, what resources you need to do it. Can you use one trailer, two trailers, or what the sensitive areas are? What are the different considerations for wildlife, et cetera? So again, a tool that is included in the GRS just to make, do the proper response actions, et cetera. Next page. The last page of the GRS is aerial photos. Again, for people that are working in an area they're not familiar with, this is a way for them to have a feeling or introduction to what the area is and the challenges are for what has to be done. Next one. So there's different tactics for deploying boom in exclusion, diversion, deflection, and basically it's done on location, tide. A lot of times you want to direct oil to a certain area for recovery, which can get a lot of people very upset. For example, one area you want to, if possible, deflect oil to is a nice white sandy beach, which really upsets people. But the reason you do that is because it's very easy to recover. If it's on a rocky shoreline or a lot of riprap, that that recovery and that removal is very very complicated. And that was one reason the Bouchard cleanup was rarely, it was a tough one. Next one. Oil spill response trailers. We have the response plans. Now we need equipment. We have 83 trailers staged around 70 coastal communities. Each of the trailers have 1,000 feet of boom and ancillary equipment that is needed to deploy it. Next slide.
Julie, could I just interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
I'm having trouble finding the source of the background noise. So
I don't know. I have there's nothing here.
Okay, I'm hearing some. I don't know.
I am too. I don't know. It's not on my end.
So if I could just request that people mute themselves.
Yeah, I heard that too.
Okay, thank you.
As I said, 70 communities, 81,000 feet of containment boom, 1,000 in each. We also have larger boom at Mass Maritime and New Bedford State Pier. We retain ownership, but and we have the Mass Moran Environmental is our MOSPRA contractor who maintains and restocks all the trailers. One important thing to realize is that in 2003 for the Bouchard, we had none of this equipment. Now we have 81,000 feet of boom and equipment we did not have staged across the coastline, which can be used for mutual aid. If we have a larger spill, I'm not going to name anywhere because I don't want to talk about having large spills. In one area, we can certainly call for trailers from, say, the North Shore to come to the South Shore to assist. And we would be looking for just the trailer. We're not requesting staff or workers or fire departments. We're just looking for the trailers. So we have that equipment available for, for the entire state. Next one. We also have, which this is 42-inch boom, is if you stand up boom, you have, it's solid. It has a float on the top, and then it has what's called a skirt that goes down into the water with a ballast chain that holds it in place. 42-inch boom, 42 inches from the floor up is very large and would be used for offshore large incidents. It's definitely contractor led. Coast Guard was getting themselves out of equipment. They just don't want to be an equipment resource any longer. And we're just going to get rid of some of this equipment. So we were able to acquire 11,000 feet of the material. It's on flatbed trailers in boxes down at US Cape Cod, Joint Base Cape Cod, and it was free. It's brand new. It was replacement material for the Deepwater Horizon spill. So it's never been splashed, but we are planning, basically it's going to be a step-by-step kind of process for a drill on what equipment do you need to even get this equipment to a location for deployment? What do you need for the deployment? There's a lot of pieces that are included in working with material this large, but it's contractor led. But we have it. We could share it with other states nearby if it needs to be used. So it's nice to have it here in the Commonwealth versus it being a resource that was lost. Next one. We're going to get next into, we have the plans, we have the equipment. Now we need to have exercises and drills and training. 2020 really threw us off our schedule because no exercises, nothing live could be done. We started with a couple in 2021. We usually do 6 to 7 a year. This year we are doing 13 to try to catch up. In May, we did 4 in a row. It was hard to determine on day 3 where we were. So I don't think we'll be advising that again because that got really, really tough on the planning and the actually holding of the exercise. For Martha's Vineyard, we spend 2 days out there and do 3 towns each day. And that gets interesting because the islands in Nantucket, they have a lot of challenges, being islands. So they really have to try to be as self-sufficient and aware of how using the equipment, as possible. Next one. A couple of the exercises and how they are held. HSEEP is the Homeland Security Exercise Planning Model. So if we use the HSEEP full scale exercise model, it really is a level of respect and quality that is the way they're being run. Since 2010, we've had 84 exercises, which is a number that we're very proud of. And to date, we've trained 2,194 first responders. Those are 2,194 first responders we did not have in 2003. That number is kind of a lot to digest. I love that number. It makes us, very proud of the program and very proud of the accomplishments. It has great legs, it has great funding, and I don't see it ending. It's constantly being improved and changed as we go along with what we learn. And, it's an example of how good things can come out of bad thing. So, the Commonwealth is so much more ready. The GRSs are revised after field exercises. If we test a booming tactic and it doesn't work, we're going to change it. We're going to delete it from the plan. We're going to revise it. After action reports are prepared after each exercise and approved by the exercise planning team in DEP. And again, the information is all in the Coast Guard sector plans, which really is a tool to make it information available across the board of a spill. Next one. For the training day, we have the initial planning meeting. The meetings for the fall exercises are starting to be held now. We are held to spring and fall for the exercises. No coastal community wants to talk to DEP about training in the summer. So we're limited to spring and fall. We're starting to plan the trainings for fall now in June with initial planning meeting. That's hopefully, these are all virtual now, except for the hands-on final planning meeting. It does all the logistics, et cetera, are figured out in those 2 meetings. The training day itself consists of a classroom session, about an hour, MOSPRA and boom deployment, et cetera, 101. Establishes the incident command, which it will be presented under equipment familiarization. We added a section where around the trailer, people learn how to put boom together. They learn how to put anchoring systems together. Also, we have culvert plugs that can be blown up for drainage resources and other kinds of booming and equipment. And so they get hands-on before the material is actually put in the water. There is then a full boom deployment, which is, entails taking the material out of the trailer. Some of these towns and some of these attendees have not even seen what's in that trailer. So it really is, first time lesson, and then also the boom deployment and hands-on. So let's go next. Let's get to some exercises. This is a map, the tactics map that is developed during the actual planning. you'll see, if you can see, you'll see the red hash lined area around the marina. That's a plan to contain with boom that area. And then also the blue icons identify anchoring systems. Boom is not deployed by just putting it in the water and throwing it around a vessel. It's not going to do anything. So the anchoring systems are important to keep it in the configuration that you need it to be in. Also to the left, you'll see the little triangle. Again, that is containing a vessel in a harbor or at a mooring. We include that in the trainings because that is what most harbors or marinas are going to have to deal with. Sinking vessels, just, fire, just emergency situations regarding a vessel taking on water. You need 3 to 5 times the length of the vessel to put around for containment. And again, the anchors are what keep it, that's what keeps it. You always need the anchoring systems, and that makes it a lot more complicated than people really think it is. Next one. That's what it came out as. Not bad for, first try, introduction to it. So it's the same area. The little vessel on the left, some anchoring could be done in the front to keep it a little more circular, But this is the Steamboat Wharf Marina in Hull. This, we have towns that work so well together. It's impressive. And Hull and Hingham have an amazing work experience that they were able to do both of these configurations at once. The incident commander, who is a fire chief or someone that's identified during the planning, to play the role of incident commander, and that person was able to activate crews, strike teams on land, strike teams on water, to actually do both of these configurations at the same time. And that just really, that's impressive, because to be able to, operate a large amount of people, large amount of vessels is fantastic. I have to thank Nuka Research for providing us with drone footage. That's something that's fairly recent that really helps let people have the bird's eye view of what is really being done. So thank you. Next one. Again, just Plymouth and Kingston. This was around the dock or the harbor to keep oil out. Again, boom is used to either keep it out of an area or honestly to bring it into an area for shoreside recovery. You'll see in the left picture, the brown material going under the bridge. That is actually peat moss. We deploy peat moss, which does not cause any harm. It dissipates, but it acts like oil. It has the same configuration, floats the same, etc., as oil. So we use that as a tool to test one of the booming tactics. Does it work? Does it not work? In this case, it was interesting because it looks like it was going to do pretty well. The wind changed drastically, went outside the boom and down the water. So it's very specific on ebb tide, high tide, what kind of wind we have, etc. So there's a lot of limitations, a lot to it. Next one. Just quickly, Falmouth, it's hard to see. On the left top, you can see the orange line. That is the boom that's being deployed. This is a first responder training. If there is not a GRS tactic to test, we still want the hands-on training. So we have them put out, hundreds of feet of boom and then just see how it is to pull it by a boat. A lot of towns learn that their boats are not satisfactory to pull boom. It's like people have defined it as like snow plowing water. So you get a lot of draw and stuff from it. So it takes a lot of work, but again, great introduction. The picture on the right is basically the after the deployment all is done, there's a hot wash or a review of what was learned, what worked well, what needs to be changed. And you'll see a couple of Coast Guard personnel there. We have excellent involvement and attendance with the Coast Guard, always from, North Nero and Cerro, which is fantastic. Next one. Dartmouth, just real quickly, you can see on the right the amount of boom. It's not light, it's heavy, with 1,000 feet in the trailer. Before it is put back in the truck afterwards, it is rinsed with water so that it doesn't, it's not salt water in the trailer and doing more harm to it. Dartmouth is kind of interesting. You'll see 2 jet skis on the top left, which we all thought was very interesting. They are the fire departments. And it was a great tool to use to bring the boom from the shoreline out to the vessel. So we haven't had a lot of people requesting jet skis, but I probably shouldn't talk about them because we'll probably get a request on the grant program. Next slide. This was a vessel fire that happened in New Bedford, and I just wanted to put this up. It was a Miss Dunya yacht, 82 feet. Fairhaven and New Bedford both responded to this. You'll see obviously on the bottom right, the boat totally covered with flame. You'll see in the top of the same picture, the white square, that is our trailer, and the ER response vehicle. Top left is one of my favorite pictures. This is a textbook deployment of containment boom. Anchoring systems, just, from the pier around the vessel, just, perfectly, done. And basically without the hands-on training and the equipment, this doesn't happen. Unfortunately, Fairhaven and New Bedford have a lot of experience with the trailers and the equipment, but this was, textbook and really, really impressive. And of course, the bottom left is what was left. Next one. We always invite other parties to these trainings. We always reach out to, local press during the initial planning meetings. If there's local press, if there's a town manager, invite the selectmen. We've had the mayor come by. The Department of Fire Services offers their resources. The fire chief can request the DFS rehab unit or something. Marine Fisheries has attended a lot of the trainings. So if a name or a recommendation comes up, we always, encourage people like that to show up. Later on, we gave a grant to the New England Wildlife Association, and they came to one of the trainings, a couple of the personnel to understand this part of it more. Their grant was to allow them to do training and also to build out response kits for animal rescue, at the time of a release. And good press. Next one. On to tugboats. The Bouchard B-120 was entering Buzzards Bay heading towards the canal. The thought was if that, a barge is a floating tub of oil. There's a notch in the back on the stern of that barge that a tugboat slips into. So the tugboat is the motoring source of a tug and barge unit. Our tug escorts are basically providing another tug that is just available for assistance. If they're off channel, if they have a wind or mechanical or something of a problem, our escort tug is available to do just that, to assist and help with the escort the travel of that vessel through Buzzards Bay and Cape Cod Canal into the Cape Cod Bay. Next one. Vessels carrying 6,000 barrels or more of oil must have a tug escort to enter the areas of special interest. And they include Cape Cod Canal, Mount Hope Bay, Vineyard Bay, and also beyond that, we don't have to, we're hoping to expand that. And it's important to realize that each barge that is coming through carries 1 to 4 million gallons of petroleum. And that's a hard number to wrap my head around, even still at those kind of volumes. Bouchard B-120 was 100,000 gallons. So that really, Massachusetts, that's hopefully our biggest, but there's a lot of potential. And, having the tug escort is a huge improvement. Again, it was part of, if the tug escort had been on board, had been in effect, would the Bouchard B-120, spill even happened? Next one. Navigational aids are a huge part of the Oil Spill Act. Ports is a system for real-time navigational data. We put navigational buoy at the Buzzards Bay end of the canal. I've been saying, if people have seen or heard me talk about navigational aids, this buoy is physically going to be in the water within the next 2 weeks, which is fun. They look at sea state, wave height, wind, and other factors that help a mariner identify, do I want to transit this now, or do I want to wait at anchorage for the sea state to change? We have another buoy at the Cape Cod Bay end of the canal, so there'll be a buoy at both ends. The canal is so serpentine and such a small, as far as canals go for width and depth, that to have this data, because at one end of the canal, the sea state, et cetera, can be totally different than at the other end. So instead of saying, well, I guess it's okay, let's try to do this now, there's real live information that can be looked at. It's available to everyone. It's public information. If you go on ports, and you can look up the Cape Cod ports program, we have the Buzzards Bay buoy, the Cape Cod buoy, and the current Cape Cod current meter that is installed at Mass Maritime, again, for currents right in that area, which are very, very strong. Rhode Island, for Narragansett ports, Rhode Island had 3 sensors that they have been paying for years. And Jim Ball down there approached me and said, Julie, the sensors are in Fall River. So we have taken over the O&M and the cost of those 3 sensors, and now they are part of, they're going to stay in Narragansett ports because that's physically the area that they're in, but still now they are part of our port system too. The MOSPRA funding for the Buzzards Bay buoy and operation and maintenance plan for the current meter in the Cape Cod Bay buoy, we just put out $905,000 for a 5-year agreement. But this is exciting. Exciting. Next one. Oh, again, just more on ports. Like I said, the data runs out like on a 6-minute a schedule, so the data is always available. And again, my brother has a boat. I said, get on this program, and he just, a lot of people, it's one of those things that is out there, may not be known. Tidesandcurrents.noaa.gov is their page, but as I said, and it sounds kind of silly, one of the best ways to get the information is just to Google NOAA ports, and then it's the Cape Cod system. Next one. The New England Clean Bilge Program. This was developed in 2015 as a project, a pilot project to identify and try to address the numerous number of oil spills that take place and bilge pump outs that take place in New Bedford Harbor. New Bedford Harbor has over 300 fishing vessels at any one time in the harbor, and then transients that come in and leave on a short schedule. A lot of the problem is that the vessels are just pumping out their bilges right into the harbor. That is not the legal way to do this. We have been we were actually performing pump outs, and hopefully that would help send the message to the fishermen that there is a proper way to do this. We kind of became the free pump out program, not quite what we wanted to be. And because of COVID, or at the time of COVID, the pump outs were stopped in 2020. And we are currently looking at a way of where are we taking this moving forward, because it was a pilot project. It's been, we've given it a lot of time. We've put a lot of money into it, and we're just kind of looking at what is the benefit, and what have we, how have we changed the mantra and the behavior. So we are in another phase right now of assessing where do we go from this point moving forward. Next one. Grant program. This was exciting. We had our grant program in 2021. First grant program we've ever had, certainly to enhance the protection of our coastline and demonstrate clear benefits to the coastline and the waterways to prevent and respond. Round 1, 9 grants, total of $214K. As I said, the New England Wildlife Center was a great grant. Response kits were made and training. Steve Mahoney and myself went to their facility, and really it's so impressive. And I'm not I'm not a wildlife bird person, and just to see this part of a spill response and to help them build their capability through the grant is very rewarding, and will be as we move forward. Again, replacement oil tanks, drones and floor cameras, responder training, more training than we do, and then different sensors for identification and response. Next. I am going to move things on now to our latest project with Sierra Fletcher, who's with Nuclear Research and Planning, evaluate adapting oil spill preparedness and response. This was initiated, and I'm not going to talk too much because I know Sierra will say it better. There isn't a lot of study or looking at climate change, et cetera, on the sense of oil spills. Particularly, there's a lot of other things, but how is it going to affect oil spills, response, preparedness, et cetera, and specifically the MOSPRA program? What is this going to do for us changing this program and adapting to the changes that are here and are coming? So I'd like to pass it on to Sierra and get into this. This is a great study that we have going, and yes.
Thanks, Julie. I think you said that great. And I'm just going to ask for a time check. How much time should I aim for?
We have the next 15 minutes set aside for this. So,
okay, that should work out just fine then. And hopefully we'll be sure to have time for questions too. So my name is Sierra Fletcher. I work with Nuclear Research. I'm not the person who should be here giving the presentation. That's Elise DeCola. She is on vacation right now. So if you have questions I can't answer, and Julie and Steve Mahoney can't help with, and we'll just follow back up with folks. So this is a project that Nuke has been working on for about the last year with help from Julie and Steve and their guidance, and also working with a colleague, Katie McPherson from Resilience and Foresight Services in Canada. You can go to the next slide, please. So Julie captured the overall question that we're trying to answer with this project really well. It's to identify what should people be thinking about related to oil spill prevention and response and preparedness when it comes to the future of climate change. The actual activities that are being done here, described in the objectives, are updating a 2009 threat evaluation to see how coastal oil spill threats may have changed since that time. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a study that was done early on in the process that Julie was describing after the MOSPRA Act started, and to help identify places for some of those trailers and priority areas for development of the GRSs that she was talking about. So we're going to be looking at the movement and of oil and the risks and hazards associated with it, but in the context of changing climate and the natural hazards that are going along with that, as we're already seeing around the country, really. And then trying to consider also of all the activities that are underway in Massachusetts to adapt to or mitigate climate impacts, how do those play into oil spill preparedness as well? And then finally, as Julie said, we're going to be looking at trying to develop some recommendations for consideration in the state. I'm sorry, I should be saying the Commonwealth. I know that. Consideration in the Commonwealth about thinking of oil spill preparedness going forward. And the actual activities, in addition to that threat evaluation, we've been doing a lot of interviews with folks, and hopefully there'll be others, maybe some of you who are involved here who'll be willing to be interviewed. We'll be putting together an assessment report that will build off of a literature survey that we've also done. And we'll be doing some workshops in the fall, and I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the slides here. So you can go to the next one, please. So the simplest way maybe to describe what a lot of us are already experiencing associated with climate change is the weather changes and more severe and more frequent extreme weather events. So places that maybe were easy, no-brainer, safe areas to store oil or places to be moving oil in the past now might be subject to more flooding or severe rain events or storms. So that's a big part of what we'd be looking at. And I think the key takeaway in that context is that while because of both sort of practicalities and legal structures coming from the national level, a lot of the planning and work that goes on related to natural disaster preparedness is done separately from the oil spill context. And so what we would anticipate going forward is that there could be more cases where it's not kind of quote unquote, if you don't mind, just an oil spill, not to minimize the severity of that, but maybe looking at more cases of an oil spill in the context of a hurricane, or maybe like in the image here from Hurricane Katrina, it's oil spilling and it's going into neighborhoods, and it's a different kind of a response than say the barge example that you've got in Massachusetts that Julie talked about as well. So that's a kind of a theme of what we'll be looking at going forward, is how are these climate change associated hazards going to dovetail with both spill prevention and response efforts. The next slide, please. So that also, as I mentioned, means looking at how climate adaptation policy and efforts can dovetail with spill prevention and response. And this is just one example that we've come up with, and there'll be a lot more effort to explore other examples and to dive deeper on this one as well. But if you look at the left side of the map, the left-hand map there, that's just a zoom in on the GRS map that Julie showed. And GRSs are identified based on areas that are sensitive resources for some reason. Wetlands are a great example of often coming up as, very ecologically sensitive area as a priority to protect. But if you look at the map on the right side, that shows the anticipated storm surge inundation zones in that same area. And if you start looking at a wetland, not, again, I use my air quotes here, not just as an ecologically important sensitive environment, but also as a buffer and a critical area for the protection of other areas from these increased storm surge events as well, then that can start to shape how you're thinking about your prioritization in oil spill events in particular. So that map on the right comes from Resilient MA, which is a website developed by the Commonwealth with a lot of great information in understanding and trying to anticipate some of the changes that will be coming, and in some cases are already happening. And that's the kind of information that we're going to be pulling together with the oil spill hazard side of things. That's exemplified just here by that map on the left. The next slide. So this is the last kind of overarching theme of what we're exploring, and that is, how does decarbonization policy affect spill prevention and response efforts? So on the right, that's just a hypothetical graph. Massachusetts has some very aggressive goals for reducing reliance on fossil fuels. If they all go down as hoped for, as planned on due to policy changes, then on a very simplistic level, great, we don't have to worry about oil spills. However, the question is, what are they going to be replaced with, and where is it going to move? If it's a liquid fuel, for example, or LNG or LPG, how is it moving through the state areas, waters and land? And what do we need to know about and be anticipating there? And part of this is related to shipping, certainly, and related to the fuels that ships are using. But another part of it is really going to end up being driven by the policy and infrastructure changes made that will determine what fuels are being used by people within the Commonwealth. Or parallel, we are giving kind of a regional perspective on that too, because we're looking at things that might be moving through the area, both on water and on land. And I'm in Maine, so maybe we're the end of the pipeline for things that will be coming through Massachusetts at some point. The next slide, please. So back in 2009, we did this first threat assessment, and we call it a threat assessment because we really weren't looking at the consequence side of anything related to oil spills, just simply where is oil moving through Commonwealth, focusing on coastal areas. And this is what helped to develop, again, those priorities for where trailers might be located back when the MOSPRA program efforts were getting underway. Tank vessel transits, that's both the barges that Julie was talking about, as well as tankers, were the highest sources of exposure, followed by land-based storage and non-tank vessel. And then you probably wouldn't be surprised about how some of the regional exposures broke down. So this is the document, this is the report that we'll be updating with the climate context going forward. The next slide, please. And another historic. I guess you can say 2019 is historic because it was the before times, before COVID. Everything seems like a long time ago now. This is another resource that has already been developed that is a study about the movement of hazardous materials through the Commonwealth. This is on land as well as coastal areas. That's another piece of information that we have that we're updating when we're looking into the climate study. In that case, it was focusing specifically on presenting material so it could be used for local emergency planners. So it's all very much pulled together and broken down by municipality to provide information for people about what is in or moving through their areas. And then if you go to the next slide, this is back to the project that we're doing now. This is this integrated threat and climate impact assessment. So with those two studies that I just mentioned as kind of baselines for reference, we're going to be evaluating changes in the movements of oil and hazardous materials from 2009 to 2022. We have got a couple of changes in data sources, which are great. We've got the OR1 data that's reported to the state now. Again, I understand under the MOSPRA requirements associated with that per barrel tax that was mentioned. And that is information that we can use to get a picture of the petroleum movements. We're also looking at AIS data, which is signals sent from vessels, and using that as a way of counting and looking at movement of tankers. And we can't see the barges themselves always, but we can see the tugs that are pulling the barges. And so based on their behaviors and where they're going, we can identify which ones are likely moving oil and estimate the amounts moving around based on that. And again, in that case too, it's important to have this regional perspective. New England is not that big. And so we're looking at trying to understand based on these different sources, where's stuff moving through with an eye towards, what could be moving past Massachusetts, even if not coming for delivery to Massachusetts. So in looking at that, we're going to also apply those two themes I mentioned earlier, trying to understand the changing climate and natural hazards piece, like what's happening in the natural environment, those more extreme and frequent weather events, and then also the climate mitigation and decarbonization. So what's being done that's changing things in response to climate change. And then using all of that to develop some scenarios, which are going to serve a couple of different purposes. One is, so this is baseline information to help us consider in a workshop context, how might these things be changing and what are some options related to oil spill preparedness and response? And then the information will also be available for any future analyses to serve as a baseline as well, if there's a need to go back and check how the trends were. Did we get the scenarios right or not in the future? Next slide, please. So this is just a quick look at the movements of oil into Massachusetts you can see 2014 to 2020. So this is the newer source of data, the OR1 data that I mentioned. It's not that there was nothing moving in 2014 or 2013 to 2014. That's just an artifact of how the data were compiled. And I believe when everything started to be submitted in a more efficient way around 2014, we suddenly start to get more information. There's some other nuances to changes with that data as well. But what you can see here, if you can kind of squint well enough to read the legend, that very top line is gasoline. And then it's not exactly driving straight down yet. With that decarbonization goals that I mentioned, that will probably change. But we assume that the dips that you see both for gasoline, and then it's also obvious in the red line for jet fuel or aviation fuels, that those are pandemic driven reductions. We were flying less and driving less all of a sudden there. So we are going to add the 2021 data to this, and that will give us a sense of whether those, confirming that those were pandemic related dips. But the kind of takeaway for this right now is that we're not yet decarbonized. Massachusetts will probably beat most of the rest of us out of the gate on that. But even in Massachusetts, it's not happening quite yet. So when we're talking about that decarbonization, we're looking longer term, and that's what's important to be doing now. The next slide just also goes back to that concept of this shipping incidents in particular. So this is an area where I think of it as kind of two tracks. There's what's being moved into the state and how that changes, and that's going to be driven by those policies and infrastructure changes associated with decarbonizing in Massachusetts. But at the same time, you've already got pushes from the International Maritime Organization and some shipping companies on their own as well, trying to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Shipping is a big sector for greenhouse gas emissions overall. And so you see just a whole crayon box of different options of fuels that are being talked about as the next best thing. And it may well play out differently for different vessels, depending on their routes, depending on what type of vessel it is, exactly what they land on. But it's going to be changing, and it is already changing from being pretty typically, diesel and heavy fuel oil as the two things that you might be responding to from a vessel's own fuel. So there's the cargo part of it, which will be probably Massachusetts driven, but then there's a more globally driven part of it that is the vessel's own fuel that it's using. So on the next slide is just an example from some early work that's coming out as all these new potential alternative fuels are being explored. There's some work coming out considering what will happen if they are spilled or if there's an accident involving a vessel that's using one of them. And this is a really critical part of the work that we will continue to be doing in this project. There is going to be a big difference if that vessel switches to using a biofuel than if it's using LNG. There could be cases where it's not as much of a problem as an oil spill if a fuel spills, which is excellent. There could be cases where you have a different problem. You have more of a public safety or public health problem if there's an incident than you have with an oil spill, perhaps. So that's an emerging area of work that's going on within the oil spill community right now. And it's going to continue. And I think it's excellent that Massachusetts is looking up at this and getting ready to incorporate that new knowledge into planning and preparedness, because that's the way it's going to make a difference. So the last slide, I think, is the next one. These are the next steps for the project. I've been focusing a little bit more on the quantitative on the right side there. So we're going to be completing that threat assessment that I talked about a little bit. We're going to be doing more looking at the mapping from that, resilient MA and other sources about the changes that are happening associated with climate hazards and mitigation policies, as well as looking at that from the oil spill threat lens and response lens, and working with some future scenarios to consider options for what that all could end up looking like going forward. We can't predict, but we can work with scenarios to try to come up with options. And that brings us to the opportunities for others to get involved here, which is the qualitative side. As I mentioned, we've been doing some interviews and hope to be doing some more of those, but also hosting some workshops this fall that will be kind of a chance to envision those scenarios and really work with what do I think? What can I bring to the conversation about how all these changes may affect spill preparedness and response? And then most importantly, really, is what can we do about that? If we've figured that out, what can we do about it? And that will come out in a set of recommendations. And it could be things that are, very practical and specific, down to the point of like, well, there's, this inundation zone is going to get worse, and here's some fuel tanks at a harbor. Let's figure out how to move them back. So it's going to take both the big picture thinking and the really specific practical problem solving, which I know government folks are really good at doing, especially I know a lot of the municipality folks. So that's going to be the next phase of the project. And then it will kind of get put together in a final report. And that's all I've got. And I'll just type Elisa's email into the chat in case anybody has any questions as well, and mine too. But I'm happy to take some now if there are time.
Yeah, there is time. Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Julie. There was so much great information there, and it's really impressive work. I see that you have one raised hand, Steve.
Hi, yeah, thanks for the presentation. Steve Sherman, Global Companies. Work for a company that owns some marine terminals, so familiar with some of your programs. Question for you, Sierra, around the threat assessments and so forth. You mentioned about like storage tanks and resiliency and so forth like that. In my opinion, it seems that, as a regulated entity, we have SPCC regs, we have NIPTES permits that include some form of resiliency and so forth. So to me, when I think of more inundation from climate change and so forth, it's more the non-point source, like areas getting flooded where there's hazardous material and oil stored that, in city urban areas that are going to get flushed out in the harbor. And it seems like, to me, that should be a focus as part of the threat assessment, would be related to that. And then just kind of a comment on the whole thing. It seems, and I may be off base, but from Julie's initial presentation, it came about from an oil spill. It's funded by oil transfers and so forth. So as you expand the preparedness, which totally makes sense, these other fuel sources, other concerns as the scenarios change with climate change, how does that affect the overall regulatory kind of mission and regulations governing how this organization or the act is implemented, and I guess the overall funding, because right now it's being funded by liquid fuel transfers, and is that on the radar to, if you're worried about like LNG, LPG transfers and so forth, are those subject to the funding, and is that an opportunity for you to expand?
Well, since they're directed to me, thank you for the questions. And on your first point, I think what you're describing is absolutely part of the threat assessment. It's not just big oil storage, but I think, one of the examples Elise gave me was maybe helping move some smaller oil storage that might not be regulated in the same way that you're describing for your facilities, but identifying just even where those are and putting the infrastructure and the inundation zones example together is the purpose of the study. So I'll certainly pass that comment back to her. As to the second question, I'm not sure I'm in a position to answer that for the Commonwealth. I can observe that that's a conversation happening in many other places, sort of nationally and in other places, as fuels being moved or changing. And I will also observe that, gosh, you only have a law related to oil spills after there's been an oil spill, and it's usually defined pretty narrowly to the thing that spilled at the time. So that's a dynamic that's out there. But as to the specifics for MOSPRA, I'm not the one to answer that.
Well, I will not answer that, I guess, Steve, because I don't know if there's been any discussion of that to date. But as you know, what we use the funds for, we look pretty closely under what's allowed under the MOSPRA program for what's appropriate to fund. Point taken that we're talking about different types of non-oil now in this assessment.
Right, and I was just thinking more, I just want to get it out as more of a thought, question for thought versus whether there's a plan or anything like that. And I had one other question for Julie regarding the sensitive receptors. So I'm familiar with I refer to them geographic response plan, so I need to get educated on that. The two things I run into with the planning a little bit is the sensitive receptor source information and stuff. We commonly have used the ESI maps that NOAA puts out, but those in a lot of areas, those are extremely outdated. So are you pulling your information from those, or do you have other sources? And we generally rely on what you've put out there as what needs to be protected as a good source for us. And is that a good approach, or is that would you recommend a different kind of sources? The area contingency plans, I think, in general, like to refer to the ESI maps. And again, I know some in Massachusetts are from the 80s or 90s or so.
I agree. The ESI maps are a great tool, but like you're saying, they were born quite a while ago. When the GRPs, see, I go that way too, were developed, it was done, as I said, more of a, municipal state, kind of an expert level person at that level, try to get, as we we're trying to deal during the early days of the spill with the local knowledge, is so key. And the plans are updated now in the sense of you learn more about agriculture, you learn more about, sensitive areas and how things are changing. Marshes are being rebuilt under, NRDA and different things. So we try to keep up to date more on a, as the knowledge comes to us basis, and then we add it in. But certainly we welcome anyone who has that kind of knowledge or that kind of recommendation to update and add on to the plans, to identify that, yes, something has changed. Like at the meetings for the exercises, and a lot of times we get word that, well, that's not there anymore, or this has become that, or, we look for boat ramps and things, and it's like, no, that's totally changed. So with that, any kind of information, local, professional, we take it and certainly try to incorporate it. And for the area contingency plans, I know that the Sector Boston took their ACP, and I think they took it from 800 pages down to 400 pages or something to make it a usable document. And the GRPs and all are in those, but again, updated, as needed. But the EIS maps is certainly another tool, but like you said, everything has its age.
Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Other questions? Okay, well, seeing none, thank you again, Sierra, for joining us.
Thank you.
And thanks, Julie, for all that great work. Really was happy that we could spend this time at this meeting to present it. And I think it's probably a part of our program that people are less familiar with. I know in these meetings, we tend to focus on the privatized cleanup program. So it's always really good information to get out there in terms of what other things wayside cleanup is involved in that are this important. So thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, I see a hand, Janine.
Hi, Liz and everyone. I just wanted to give a little perspective. This program started back, I don't know, 15 years ago, maybe, when I was still at Wayside Cleanup. And I just am amazed at how far it's gone and how much good work has been done and how it's evolved over time. Really amazing and really, really impressive. So good job, people.
Thank you.
And good job you, Janine.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's so much there. I got to see Julie's presentation recently at one of those area committee meetings, and I was just really surprised that I was not aware of how much was happening. So thanks. So moving on, our last topic today is PFAS, and we're mostly want to focus the discussion on last week's announcement from EPA about the updated health advisories, replacing the provisional advisories for PFOA and PFAS with interim, much lower health advisories, as well as some final health advisories for GenX chemicals and PFBS. And Paul is here to assist in that discussion, thankfully. Before we get into that, I just wanted to go through what we have been doing kind of routinely, both at the monthly meetings and at these quarterly meetings, is to just update you all on the status of the public and private well sampling programs. The programs are both wrapping up in terms of taking, funding new work at the end of this fiscal year, at the end of this month. But we have, and we continue to have updated results. And I just have two slides, one for the status of the public water supply testing and one for the private. and there's some links here to this story map that you see here, where you can check out the details, as well as the EEA data portal, where you can look at specific community supply results. And also there's information on any funding they've received to do treatment at different water supplies. You'll find that information at these different links here. At this point, there are 1,200 or so public water supplies that have tested for PFAS. Most of those took advantage of the free testing. 95% of the population served by those public water supplies have water that currently meets the state's PFAS 6 20 part per trillion maximum contaminant level. 128 are currently or were at some point serving water that exceeded that MCL. In terms of the private well sampling program, you will recall that this was focused on the 85 communities in the state where greater than 60% of the residents relied on private wells for their drinking water. So they focused it on those communities that were most reliant on private water supplies. 4,700 homeowners have applied for the program. And as I mentioned, the funding and new signups to the program have stopped, but there's still quite a few homeowners in this program, in the midst of this program, that are awaiting sampling or awaiting their sampling results. 1,959 homeowners have sampled or now ready to sample. We have results from 1,667 of those private wells. 95% of those were found to be less than the 20 part per trillion MCL. 1,200 or so were non-detect, which would be a detection limit of about 2 parts per trillion. And then you see there, I provided the breakdown in terms of those that are less than or equal to 10, 10 or above. 75% are above the 20 parts per trillion, but below our 90 part per trillion eminent hazard threshold. And 10 of the private wells tested through this program were found to be above the 90 part per trillion eminent hazard threshold to date. And as I always like to emphasize, those are the wells that are sampled through this program. There are other private wells that DEP, in terms of doing source identification work, will go out and follow up on these detections and sample around them if there are other private wells in the area, to ensure that to investigate the levels in those private wells. So we have, in the wayside cleanup program, as well as other work that's being done by PRPs, there are additional private wells that have been found to be contaminated, and where response actions and provision of installation of POET systems has occurred. So that was it for just reviewing that information. And I don't know, I invite Paul now to join in on the discussion. As I mentioned, the big announcement last week was that EPA had released the interim health advisories for PFOA and PFAS, and the final advisories for Gen X and PFBS. And the department has, in the last week or so, been focused on getting our arms around this information, and certainly it's something that the water program, our Office of Research and Standard are looking at, and we're trying to coordinate our communication on it, as the drinking water program, as you may know, is already engaged in the process of doing a 3-year review since the time that we put the PFAS maximum contaminant level into effect in Massachusetts in 2019. Part of that regulation was to conduct a 3-year review. So it's certainly taking this information into account as part of that process. But this has implications for more than just that program, obviously. It has implications for the waste site cleanup program, as well as other programs where PFAS is found in environmental media. So I think, Paul, would you like to kind of step up and continue on from here?
Sure, although I think you're doing a good job of summarizing it all. So I'll go through a few things and then we can open up for questions, and I can give you a foreshadowing that there will be far more questions than there are answers. So at this time, at least. So if you haven't been following the news with PFAS, what came out last, was it only a week ago, June 15th? Seems like an awful long time ago. EPA came out with a bunch of new things. We'll start with the good news first, or easier to digest. They did come up with final health advisories for both Gen X and PFBS. The health advisory for Gen X is 10 parts per trillion, and the health advisory for PFBS is 2,000 parts per trillion. So the good news here, to the extent that there is good news, that we've been sampling. Both of these have been part of the sampling programs that Liz described, both for public and private wells. And you're just based on the public, I went through this morning and looked at the public water supply results. And for Gen X, which has now a health advisory of 10 parts per trillion, out of the thousands of samples that have been taken for public water supplies, about 36 of them roughly actually had measurable levels of Gen X. So an incredibly small fraction. We're not seeing it. And the highest value that we saw was a little less than 3 parts per trillion. So that's why I characterize this as good news. With PFBS, with 2,000 parts per trillion, we are seeing more PFBS than Gen X. Again, out of the tens of thousands of samples that have been taken for public water supplies, we've gotten a little less than 5,000 detectable levels of PFBS. The vast majority of those 5,000 measurable levels were less than 10 parts per trillion, where the health advisory is now 2,000. And the outliers, there were 2 outliers or in the 90 parts per trillion. So again, the good news is, well, we are seeing this chemical. It's the levels we're seeing are well below the final health advisory that was just published. So just for completeness, the Gen X was based, both Gen X and PFBS, the health advisories are based on animal studies. And Gen X was based on liver effects, increased lesions in the liver, and PFBS was based upon decreased serum thyroxine, a thyroid hormone. So there's that. So let's put that aside and focus on something that's more common, PFOA and PFAS. So PFOA, before the first off, for PFOA and PFAS, these are interim health advisories that are based upon draft toxicity values that are still under review at EPA Science Advisory Board. So keep that in mind. These are preliminary levels. I think part of EPA's thinking in releasing these interim values were that Gen X and PFBS were considered safer replacement chemicals for PFOA and PFAS. And particularly with Gen X, the safer replacement coming out with a health advisory of 10 parts per trillion. It certainly made very clear that the previous health advisory of 70 parts per trillion needed revision. So I think they wanted to put the interim values out to give a clear indication of kind of what direction they were going and the potential levels of concern that they were considering. So with PFOA, the interim health advisory is, and we're still talking parts per trillion, 0.004 parts per trillion. For PFAS, it's 0.2 parts per trillion. Both of these are based upon human epidemiological studies, looking at effects to the immune system and reduced suppressed immune response, particularly for what they were saying was the tetanus vaccine. And the population of concern there that was part of the study were children 0 to 5 years of age. So I think EPA considers these fairly reliable studies. They're still under review at the SAB. I think they're expecting final comments back. They have draft comments back from the advisory board. They expect final ones later this summer, early fall. So things may firm up a little bit there, but the direction, I think, exact numbers may change, who knows, but the direction is really clear that it's substantially lower than what EPA was looking at now. On the order of a factor of 10,000 or so. It's about 5,000, a factor of 5,000 less than our 20 parts per trillion standard. This is PFOA. And kind of very importantly, it's about 1,000-fold lower than what EPA considers their minimum reporting levels for PFOA of 4 parts per trillion that they're going to be using in UCMR 5, the nationwide public water supply sampling program that will be rolling out. So that's where they stand. Our reporting limit is, as Liz had mentioned earlier, is 2 parts per trillion. Slight difference between what we're using, what EPA is using. That difference is probably relatively insignificant compared to the target levels that are significantly lower than both of those. But I will reiterate, the interim health advisories are non-enforceable guidance to the states that are currently based on draft reference doses, toxicity values. So I would view these as kind of the shape of things to come, an indication of where we're going. But in the immediate term, it's not changing what we're doing in the programs at MassDEP. The next big thing that's coming down the pipe that EPA stressed is that they are still on track to propose a drinking water standard later this fall, certainly by the end of the year. And given the information that came out with the interim health advisories and taking into account the reporting limits, the MCLs, as you may remember, not only take into account the risk posed by the chemicals, but analytical limits, technology, and cost. So we don't know what the EPA MCL, the proposed MCL, will be, but given the analytical limitations, it will probably start at around 4 parts per trillion as what they can measure, what they're using for UCMR 5, and then we don't know where the considerations for cost and technology will come into that. So we'll see when that comes through. Liz mentioned that we had built into our drinking water standard a 3-year review period where we had committed to go back and look at new information as it was coming out, because information on the PFAS compounds are coming out every day. So we made sure we built in a specific review period that is being moved up. I think, conditions, events have overtaken us. And while we'd begun to start thinking about beginning that review, it's certainly on the table, from now through the fall. And looking at the toxicity information, looking at what EPA is going to be proposing for the MCL. As a delegated state under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are required that our drinking water standards be at least as stringent as EPA's. So you can see where that would be headed, probably lower than the 20 parts per trillion. If EPA goes lower than that. Again, cost, technology, feasibility, may still play a role in what the final number will be. But whatever it is, we have to be at least as stringent as that. So we'll see where that goes. For waste site cleanup, it also means that our GW1 standard, which we always set based upon, consistent with our drinking water standards and guidelines, to the extent that the state drinking water standard changes, we would be looking at changes to the GW1 value, and that would have a ripple effect to the RC GW1 as well. So those are big things. And kind of as a side note, there's also more ecologically based studies looking at surface water effects on fish and other biota. So if we're looking at the GW1 value, there will probably also at least be a review of things like the GW3 value as well. So I wouldn't be surprised if that was also on the table for potential changes. The timing of all of that, we'll see. We'll take the lead from EPA. First, the department will take the lead from EPA on what their schedule is, since we have to be consistent with them. And then because within DEP, because waste site cleanup is being consistent with the drinking water program, we would coordinate with them as well. So however that timing works out, for efficiency's sake, I would hope we would try to have one set, regulations going out and comments coming in all at the same time, rather than staggering it. Let's see. I think I got what's on that page. The fall delegated states. So by the end of 2024, so a year and a half from now, or sometime in that time frame, I think I would expect to see a final EPA drinking water standard, a Massachusetts drinking water standard that at least matches that, and a GW1 standard and RCGW1 that matches the Massachusetts drinking water standard. So maybe in that time frame as well. It has a ripple effect on a lot of other programs here at DEP as well. This, we're fond of saying these days, it's all PFAS all the time. And it does not matter which meeting you're sitting in and who you're talking to. Each of our programs has a connection to PFAS and is struggling with a number of issues. And I want to list a few just so you realize kind of, yes, we are talking to each other, and we're trying to be consistent, and we're trying to have a coordinated effort. But to be perfectly honest, there has to be a prioritization of what we're focusing on immediate exposures, immediate risks, where people are, particularly drinking contaminated water is first and foremost our highest priority now. We have we have other things we're worried about, are concerned about, are responsible for, so we can't devote 100% of our staff to 100% PFAS all the time, although some days it seems like we could. But the other programs in wastewater, the residuals program, the biosolids, and even drinking water residuals, you have material that is often high or have measurable levels of PFAS, and there are questions about where this material can go, either to be reused or disposed, and what's safe and appropriate. There's a lot of concerns. We're putting a lot of effort into looking at the leaching of these materials, from these materials that may be land applied, from soil, leaching to groundwater, and eventually the levels that are there. And the lower the drinking water levels go, the more concerned the leaching factor is going to be. We're looking at landfill leachate, what may be coming off of landfills, and first and foremost affecting private wells or public water supplies nearby. There's potential for air emissions and how the air program is going to take into account PFAS emissions from individual facilities. There are surface water discharges and groundwater discharges that we may be concerned about. Maybe it may or will be built into permits, at least knowing what you're dealing with. The whole disposal issue, we've talked a lot about soil all the time, and more stringent PFAS levels will mean questions about how to deal with soil that has levels of PFAS in it and where it can go, so it doesn't pose a risk to groundwater. So that then competes with other soil for disposal or for reuse as well. We're looking at potential releases from Title V systems and local impacts from those systems. We're continuing the AFFF take-back program kind of at a minimal level now, and there's work done. We've talked about the interagency task force that fairly recently issued their final report, and there are a number of items in there that will probably be the focus of discussion within the legislature as a legislature report to themselves. So there are a number of items in there, including putting greater emphasis and funding towards the AFFF take-back and expanding that. There are discussions about potential funding for private well treatment, as there's funds available to support municipal and public water supplies. There's been a lot of money flowing to PFAS issues and emerging contaminants kind of writ large. The bipartisan infrastructure law and the ARPA money, a lot of that has been directed to the state revolving fund to provide support, low interest loans or loan forgiveness to systems that have to put in treatment for PFAS. And there we're talking over the next 5 years, billions of dollars going into that. At the same time, EPA announced the new health advisories. They also announced a new non-competitive grant program funded up to $1 billion for the states. MassDEP will be applying for that as well, to get money to assist systems and communities in dealing with the impacts of PFAS. So there's a lot going on in a lot of different areas. We're trying to be kind of looking at it in a coordinated way. This is one issue that DEP senior staff from across the programs meets weekly to discuss. It's the only issue we do that for at this point, because it is, it needs a coordinated effort because it touches all of these programs. And what we do in one program can have an adverse effect on how other programs work as well. So I think I've covered a lot of the stuff I wanted to talk about. I'm feeling a little bit like I did after the PFAS conference in March. There's a lot to take in, a lot of potential, a lot of work to be done, but a lot of opportunity for kind of coordinating and cooperation and working together. So it will be an interesting, probably next, certainly year and a half. And with that, we can open it up to questions. Matt Hackman has his hand raised. Matt.
Hi, Paul. Connecticut DPH tried to explain this. So what generally, I mean, EPA is coming out with 4 and 20 parts per quadrillion, and the numbers we're all using are still up in the parts per trillion. And DPH ladies seem to explain it as, you know, it was like the way they assigned contributions and how they calculated the risk. And it just seems like there's a 1,000-fold difference. And, you know.
Yeah, it's, you know, one thing the EPA did stress in their discussions was that they did use a 20% relative source contribution factor. So that may be what you're talking about, which we routinely incorporate, you know, in our drinking water standards and in the GW1 standards, that, you know, you have an allowable exposure, which is the reference dose, and you don't want to use all of it up, you know, from one source, because you're being, for many chemicals, you're being exposed in different ways, and certainly for PFAS. You're getting some from drinking water, but you're also being exposed and increasing your body burden from, frankly, the food you eat, the clothes you wear, the carpet that you put down a couple of years ago, and you're breathing material coming off of that, dust coming off of that. So they use a relative source contribution factor of 20%. With the difference, the big thing here though is the difference in toxicity value. You know, the relative source contribution is a factor of 5, it's 20%. We're talking factors of 10,000-fold different from where they were at the 70 parts per trillion. It's the study, the toxicity study that was based on, and I'm not a toxicologist. Keep in mind, you know, I used to be a risk assessor, but it's not exactly the same thing. But I've looked at those studies, and you know, long before this, you know, those studies have been out there. I was impressed back then, several years ago, about these are human studies are looking at decreased immune response, and they seem to be really solid and convincing. And the big difference is EPA's move to base the toxicity value on these immune response studies.
Okay, and you know, the other thing they mentioned is, you know, the difference between animal and human studies. And I would note that Connecticut used a 50% contribution, their DPH for drinking water as being 50% of the load for exposure to PFAS. So it's all very interesting. And so you think it's going to take until 2024 for this to filter through, or whatever, trickle down into our standards?
Yeah, I mean, given how, you know, what it takes, and, you know, because of the relationship between EPA standards versus the DEP drinking water standards, and then our relationship with the DEP drinking water standards, I'm not sure exactly what the timing is going to be. So I tried to pick a time period, you know, by the end of 2024, I would think the dust will have settled in, all the standards will be in place. It may go faster, it may not, but, you know, it takes a while to put things out for public comment. And I expect when EPA puts their draft MCL out for public comment, they are going to get a lot of comments that they're going to have to go through and evaluate and respond to. And that by itself is going to take time. And the good news is that at the end of it, everybody should at least understand EPA's position and why they chose the values that they did, and be able to read through it. I certainly expect that people will, some people will disagree with it. Some people will think that they could go further than that. But at least I would anticipate that it will be a well-documented decision when it comes out.
Thanks.
Oh,
Larry.
Hello, Paul. We're working on a PFAS site in Central Region, and there are lots of health-related questions beyond drinking water. People are asking about swimming guidelines, especially for private pools, but also for a public beach that's impacted, and also for gardening. I realize all of this is complicated and developing as we go, but might the department be able to issue some kind of interim guidance on these other categories of exposure?
I believe our Department of Public Health has some guidance about bathing at public beaches, at least this specific case that came up. And yes, I think it's kind of working our way through all of that, and having these interim values and the draft toxicity values kind of does throw things up in the air a little bit, makes it harder to come down. I think the kind of one point I didn't make before, which I meant to, but this is a good place to insert it, is in some ways, this is why we've had incorporated the critical exposure pathway concept into the regs years ago. In that when you have situations where people are drinking water that they can't avoid or breathing air that they can't avoid, that having some process in the regs to at least make people think about, are there alternatives while we're figuring all of this out? What's the recommendation? And I think across the board, what EPA is saying and DPH is saying and DEP is saying that there's a lot of information we're all trying to process, and in the interim, not to use the same word as the health advisory, but in the short term, that to the extent people can, you should minimize exposures to the extent you know what it is, but also try to put it in. But another way of looking at it as well is, the tendency, I think, for PFAS, and I'm trying to figure all this out in my head, kind of what my personal reaction would be. One thing we know from what we have been seeing with PFAS is the ubiquitous nature of it, and it's very easy to focus on kind of the areas where you have more information, and pay less attention to, and not worry about areas where you don't have as much information. And I think this plays out somewhere a bit where Connecticut may be having different relative source contribution factors, and trying to recognize and find that balance of, we are being exposed through the carpets that we're walking on, through the clothes that we're wearing, through the food that we eat, buy from the store. So for things like gardening, I'm not sure what the answer is for if there might be PFAS in the soil in my garden, should I not grow edible crops there? Should I only grow flowers? But as a former risk assessor, one question I would also ask is, well, and what is the alternative? If the food that you buy from the store comes wrapped in material that contains PFAS to keep it waterproof, what are the relative exposures? I don't know the answers to any of this, but we are being exposed to PFAS from a number of different sources, some of which are environmental, many of which are related to the products that we use and consume. And I think one of the things that you see in the interagency task force report, which I highly recommend, is a focus on trying to get PFAS compounds out of consumer products, and consideration of, which is out of DEP's realm, but it's in the task force's realm. Is the focus can't solely be on treating the drinking water or removing contaminated soil, because there are other exposures out there that are related to consumer products. We're doing our part with the AFFF take back. Right. But it's a very complicated balance of these things. And for this your specific question about, are we going to come out with guidance on kind of some of those other exposures which are likely to be occurring, but are orders of magnitude lower than the drinking water standards, the drinking water exposures. We're trying to do that, but we're also putting a lot of our resources and emphasis on the exposure that we know to be the primary source at 21 East sites, which is the actual drinking of contaminated water with elevated levels.
Right, and that's our focus too on the site we're working on, but nonetheless, there are questions about whether people can swim in their pool, whether they have to kill their chickens, whether they should throw away their raspberries that they're growing, and we have no answers for that. And from a public relations perspective, it's very difficult. So I can accept that you don't have an answer, but I also have to state that telling people it's complicated doesn't answer their question.
Yeah, and I'm telling you guys it's complicated. The risk communication is partly geared towards the audience that you're talking to. And I know the Central Regional staff is working with you and others. And I know our Office of Research and Standards has been asked for that, and they are working on answers to those questions. But they're not immediate, but they are aware of the questions and they're working on it.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
David.
So just a short reaction to that question and Paul's answer, which is I've been following a lot of the stuff that's happening up in Maine, and Songbird Farm in Maine is an organic grower that got crushed last year when their water and then their produce was tested. And so in the world of it's complicated, they were trying to sell organic food, including eggs and other produce. And those food products were actually tested, and the food products were found to contain high levels of PFAS. So I don't have an opinion about eating the raspberries in someone's backyard in Central Mass, but it is true that the PFAS is getting into the food stream, and we don't understand that very well. Anyway, just
there are. I mean, it is way complicated, and there are gradations. I mean, just to make it more complicated, there are locations where farms have taken year after year materials that contained high levels of PFAS, and also to add further complication, a decade ago or longer, those materials, biosolids, land applied to farms and the like, had higher levels of PFAS than they do now. And that's just another axis to make this another dimension to make it more complicated, what we're seeing in the groundwater from leaching from the soil and these other materials that may have been applied, we're seeing what may have been applied many years ago. So one question that we have been struggling in our leaching modeling has been struggling with is, what does that mean for the materials being applied now and the current levels? But then to take what's happening at a farm that may have had decades of use of these materials and compare it to somebody's backyard and garden, where they may have gone to a big box hardware store and bought a bag of compost, one bag of compost material and put it in, a one-time application of something that may have who knows what levels. So in some ways it's the same migration pathway, but we're not clear whether what the relative magnitudes are and the time periods. So because a farm in one situation had measurable levels in the raspberries doesn't necessarily mean that your local, your backyard raised bed is going to have the same problem. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily different from what you might buy in the supermarket. So one thing, again, no answer, but as a former risk assessor, I would be wary about having people avoid one source because about it, but driving them to potentially the same equivalent or higher exposure somewhere else just because it has been measured. And I think this with PFAS, we're particularly with home gardening, where the levels are likely to be relatively low in the produce, there may not be much of a difference between that and what you would buy in the supermarket. I don't know. There are so many areas in this data gaps that need to be filled before one can really speak authoritatively about it.
Agreed. I wasn't trying to over accentuate the risk, and certainly eating fresh produce has great nutritional value compared to everything else you can get. So,
well, that's it. It reminds me of a number of years ago we were having discussions with the Department of Public Health about the relative risks of contaminants in fish versus the benefits of eating fish, and we actually had a great Harvard School of Public Health arranged a great one-day kind of workshop for DPH and DEP, and I went to it, and the data provided about kind of the incredible benefits of eating fish at a certain frequency, versus some incremental risk of excess lifetime cancer risk from eating fish that might have elevated levels of some contaminant. It was an interesting comparison to make in kind of and where you draw that line, and this is all kind of what becomes a significant risk, and how you weigh the costs and benefits, the risk versus benefits. And there were strong feelings by very qualified, very well-educated people who know a lot more about it than I do, that given the levels that were being seen in the fish of the contaminants, that eating the fish was provided substantially more benefits. And it's that sort of question that we're going to be struggling with PFAS, particularly since there are data gaps in what the levels actually are. So a lot more to be learned here, and I understand everybody's desire to have the answers as quickly as possible, but we're all trying to figure it out. Jeff.
Morning, Paul. Hearing reports of septic haulers expressing apprehension, refusal to collect septic tank waste from homes with impacted private wells. There's been nothing I've seen directing them not to, or wastewater plants not to be accepting these materials yet anyway. Is that something that, I don't know, some kind of announcement, let these folks know that, you know, currently that's fine?
Yeah, I will ask our kind of wastewater people and people related to that. The kind of one, you know, if that potentially opens up floodgates. You know, we don't know what's necessarily in a, you know, the pump out, what the levels are. The wastewater treatment plants that accept it have their own kind of weighing of liability. You're typically, you do the pump out, the trucks would bring it to a wastewater treatment plant, and it would enter the system there. Those wastewater treatment plants are being asked to, you know, sample you know, various stages for PFAS, and they're certainly seeing it at different levels. So they will be kind of looking back upstream at potential sources of PFAS in a desire to lower the levels that are passing through their system. And we've run across that. It's not a Title V system, but we were conducting a cleanup at a site. We were doing state-funded work and had to discharge to a municipal sewer system that went to a wastewater treatment plant, and we were required by the wastewater treatment plant to treat the discharge for PFAS before it entered their system. So we understand the treatment plant's concerns. We understand firsthand what it's like to be asked to do that treatment or be required to do that treatment ourselves. But I think we would tread lightly into beginning to issue kind of letters saying it's okay to do this or it's okay to do that without a lot of kind of more background information to base those statements on. Yeah, I think you know, we'll certainly talk about it, and people have raised that, and we're aware of that issue. And you know, within the discussions with the treatment plant operators and others, you know, we are having those discussions.
So in the interim, not sure what to tell the people, and the guy won't come and pump out their septic system.
There are some things we can't, you know, DEP can't make them accept it. And even if, you know, if we came out with a statement saying, you know, we think it's okay, you know, without actual data about what's in it and where it's going and what else is going to be going to that treatment plant, you know, our statements would probably be generic, and the individual hauler is still going to say, is it worth it to me? And yeah, it's going to be a decision that they're going to have to make. And you know, we can do education. We are talking with them about it, but I'm not sure a statement from DEP would be as effective as one would hope.
Well, I think the concern is that absent anything, they're apprehensive, rightfully so, I guess. But it's not prohibited currently.
Yeah, and yeah, it is going to be a long process to kind of, unfortunately, figure all of this out, because it's not something that we can shut off the source of PFAS. We can't just ban it. You know, well, one could ban it from commerce, but it's going to take a long time for what's already out there in the environment to kind of work its way through the system. So, you know, my personal opinion is that, you know, how we do has to recognize that it's going to take some time for all of these different programs within the EP and the folks in the private sector that kind of implement the programs, whether, you know, waste haulers or wastewater treatment plant operators, all of that. You know, they have to have an idea of kind of where we're going with it, and they have to be given time to adapt to it. You know, a sudden shock to the system is because all of this is so interconnected will create adverse effects elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, like I said, going into this, I'm not going to have a lot of good answers to it. It's more recognition that we understand how complicated it is and how big the stakes are. But if any of you know an easy solution, let me know. You're all looking kind of sober and serious. Any other questions? I mean, to the extent that there is good news, at least there are a lot of resources being thrown at this, and the ARPA money, the infrastructure money, the extra $1 billion EPA is issuing to states for through grants. The Baker-Polito administration has been very supportive, adding money to the budget for this. There is a lot going on, and you know, the silver lining in all of this is it could have happened at a worse time when there wasn't money available. You know, particularly for right now, the drinking water suppliers that are trying to deal with this. They could, you know, there are years they could have been completely on their own without this additional support. So it's at least encouraging that there's money available to help out. It doesn't solve everybody's problems, but it helps. And there seems to be a recognition kind of up and down government that, you know, this is something that has to be addressed. No more raised hands?
No more raised hands.
We're down to 53 participants, so we've driven away, you know, a good couple dozen.
Well, seeing no more raised hands, I think we'll let you all go off to your day. And I want to thank everyone for being here. And thank you, Paul, for that last discussion. Very helpful. And we will continue to hold our monthly meetings over the course of the summer. Our next Wayside Cleanup Advisory Committee meeting will be in September. So happy summer to everyone, and take care. Hope to see you soon. Thanks for being here.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
Paul.
you.
Bye.
Bye.